What nobody knew in 1979, what would remain hidden until long after the greatest fighter who ever lived had lost his own battle, was that a promise made to a dying child in a Chicago hospital would become the closely guarded secret of Muhammad Ali's life. For 30 years, the world's most famous man carried a vow that would redefine everything we thought we knew about courage. On a gray afternoon in February 1979, Muhammad Ali walked through the pediatric oncology wing of Children's S. Memorial Hospital in Chicago. He was 37, 3 years removed from his last championship, his hands already beginning to betray the tremor that would one day silence the man who shook up the world. The hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and fear, the fluorescent lights humming over linoleum floors that, too, reflected nothing but artificial brightness. Ali had come for a routine charity visit, an hour of autographs and photo opportunities that his manager had scheduled between a speaking engagement and a flight to Los Angeles. He'd done dozens of these visits. Smile for the cameras, inspire the kids, leave before the reality of pediatric cancer units settled too deeply into the chest. But in room 407, something would happen that no camera would capture. The boy's name was Thomas Hearns, no relation to the boxer, and he was 9 years old. Leukemia had reduced him to 73 pounds. His skin translucent enough to trace the blue rivers of veins beneath. His mother, Rita Hearns, sat in the chair beside his bed, where she'd sat for 46 consecutive days. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch since the doctors had used the phrase weeks, not months, in the hushed tone medical professionals reserve for conversations they wished they didn't have to have. Rita's grief was a physical thing, settled in her shoulders, pressing her into that vinyl chair like gravity had been recalibrated specifically for mothers watching their children die. Thomas knew who was coming. He'd insisted his mother tape magazine cutouts of Ali above his bed, Ali over Foreman in Zaire, Ali dancing around Frazier, Ali with his fists raised to a sky that seemed to belong to him alone. The boy had memorized the fight records, could recite the poems, had begged his mother to rent a VCR. He could watch the Thrilla in Manila. Boxing was supposed to be about violence, but to Thomas it represented something else, proof that the body could be pushed past what seemed possible, that what could overcome physics, that grace could exist inside brutality. When Ali entered the room, he didn't bring the entourage. He'd left them in the hallway. The photographers, the hospital administrators, the handlers who choreographed these moments for maximum publicity value. He came alone, and for the first time that afternoon, he moved slowly. Not the Ali shuffle, not the theatrical float. He walked like a man approaching something sacred. The boy tried to sit up, failed. Ali crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside the bed, bringing himself down to eye level. Thomas's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Are you really him?" Ali's voice was gentle, stripped of the booming braggadocio that had defined his public persona. "I'm really me, and you're really you. That's all that matters right now, little man." What followed was not an interview, not a photo opportunity. It was 43 minutes of two people existing outside of their public identities, a boy who would never grow old, and a legend slowly realizing that fame was the loneliest form of immortality. They talked about boxing, about fear, about the difference between being tough and being brave. Thomas asked questions that children shouldn't have to ask. What does it feel like to know you? Were you going to lose? How do you stand up after you've been knocked down so many times you forget which direction is up? Ali answered with a honesty that surprised even himself. He talked about the Frazier fights, about hitting the canvas in Zaire, about the nights when his body screamed at him to quit and his pride whispered that quitting would be worse than dying. He talked about fear, real fear, not the manufactured kind you sell to television cameras. The brave man, Ali said, his hand covering the boy's skeletal fingers, isn't the one who doesn't feel afraid. He's the one who feels the fear and decides it doesn't yet to make his choices for him. Rita watched from the corner of the room, tears creating clean tracks through the exhaustion on her face. She'd heard every inspirational speech the hospital offered, the pastoral counseling, the support groups, The well-meaning platitudes about God's plan and heaven's gain, none of it had touched the stone lodged in her chest. But watching the greatest fighter in the world kneel beside her dying son, speaking to him not as a celebrity to a fan, but as one mortal to another, something shifted. Not hope. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, but something closer to peace. Permission, perhaps, to acknowledge that this was unbearable and that being unable to bear it didn't make her weak. The moment that would define the next 3 decades came without announcement. Thomas, his voice fading like a radio signal losing strength, looked directly at Ali. "Will you come to my funeral?" The room became a vacuum. Rita's breath caught. Even the mechanical sounds of the hospital, the distant beeping, the whisper of ventilation systems, the muted overhead pages, seemed to pause. This was the question no one was supposed to ask. The question that forced everyone to stop pretending. Children were supposed to fight. Mothers were supposed to believe. Strangers in positions of influence were supposed to offer encouragement and leave before the statistics caught up with the stories. Ali did not look away, did not offer false comfort, did not default to the celebrity escape route of vague promises and tight publicist-approved sentiments. His eyes held the boys, and when he spoke, it was with the weight of someone making a vow he knew would cost him. "I promise you, Thomas, when that day comes, and I'm praying God gives you more days than the doctors think, I'll be there. You have my word." Thomas's face transformed, not with happiness. He was too far gone for anything that simple, but with something more valuable, the knowledge that he'd been taken seriously, that his death would be witnessed by someone who mattered to him, that he wouldn't vanish into the statistical footnotes of pediatric oncology. Ali stayed 20 more minutes. When he finally stood to leave, he did something unexpected. He removed the boxing glove pendant he wore around his neck, a gift from his own father, worn for 15 years through every major fight, and placed it in Thomas' palm. "You keep this safe for me," he said. "When I see you next, you give it back." Thomas died 16 days later, on March 3, 1979. The funeral was held at a small Baptist church on Chicago's South Side, attended by 47 people. A family, a few neighbors, Thomas's third-grade teacher, and a handful of hospital staff who'd known the boy during his 13-month battle. The service was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday. At 1:47 p.m., a black sedan pulled up outside the church. Muhammad Ali emerged alone. No photographers, no press release, no handlers to document the moment for maximum publicity leverage. He'd flown in from Los Angeles that morning, rearranged a speaking engagement that would have paid $25,000, and told exactly 3 people where he was going. He wore a dark suit and moved through the church entrance like a man trying not to be noticed, an impossible task for the most recognizable face on the planet, but he tried. Rita Hearns looked up from the front pew, and her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Ali walked down the center aisle, past the fold-out chairs and the borrowed flower arrangements, past the open casket where Thomas lay in a suit 3 sizes too large, and sat beside her. He didn't speak, didn't offer condolences, or ask if there was anything he could do. He simply sat, one hand resting on Rita's shoulder, and stayed for the entire service. He was there when the pastor read from Corinthians, there when Rita broke down during the eulogy she'd written, but couldn't finish, there when they closed the casket and carried it to the hearse. At the graveside, as the February wind cut through the cemetery and the gathered mourners shifted in the cold, Ali stood at the back of the group, head bowed, lips moving in silent prayer. When the service ended and people began the slow drift back to their cars, he approached the grave alone. He removed a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, a drawing Thomas had made during one of Ali's later visits, depicting the 2 of them in a boxing ring together, and placed it on the casket before the first shovel of earth fell. He left the cemetery without speaking to anyone except Rita. Their conversation lasted less than a minute. He hugged her, whispered something that made her nod, and returned to the sedan. 90 minutes later, he was on a flight back to Los Angeles. No one outside that cemetery knew he'd been there. This would become the pattern for the next 30 years. When Ali was asked about Chicago, about Children's Memorial Hospital, about that period in 1979, he'd smile and change the subject. His closest friends knew he'd made some kind of promise to a sick child, but the details remained locked away. Rita Hearns received a card every year on Thomas's birthday, always handwritten, never with a return address, always signed simply with Ali's first name. When Ali's health began its long decline, the Parkinson's diagnosis in 1984, the progressive deterioration through the 90s, the slow theft of speech and movement, those cards kept arriving. The handwriting became shakier, the messages shorter, but they never stopped. It wasn't until 2009, at a fundraiser for pediatric cancer research in Atlanta, that the story began to emerge. A journalist researching Ali's charitable work tracked down Rita Hearns, now working as an advocate for families navigating childhood cancer. She'd never told the story publicly, honoring what she understood as an implicit agreement between herself and Ali. But 3 decades had passed. Ali's condition had deteriorated to the point where he rarely made public appearances. Rita decided the promise had transformed into something larger than privacy. It had become a lesson in what dignity looked like when no one was keeping score. She told the journalist everything: the hospital room, the 43-minute conversation, the funeral appearance, the 30 years of birthday cards. When the article was published in The Atlantic, it included testimony from others who'd witnessed similar moments. The hospital chaplain who seen Ali visit terminal patients without press coverage, the funeral director who logged 3 separate instances of Ali attending services for children he met during charity visits, the postal worker who'd noticed the annual cards and connected them to the same Chicago address. The revelation rippled outward. Other stories emerged. A boy in Detroit, 1982, a girl in Houston, 1995, a teenager in Philadelphia, 2001. Each time, the pattern repeated: private visit, genuine connection, promise made, promise kept. Ali had attended at least 11 funerals over 3 decades, always alone, always unannounced, always refusing to let anyone turn his grief into publicity. In 2012, when Ali's health had reduced him to a wheelchair and his speech to near silence, Rita Hearns visited him in Scottsdale, Arizona. She brought the boxing glove pendant, the one Ali had placed in Thomas's hand in 1979, which she'd retrieved from her son's casket before burial. She'd kept it safe for 33 years. Ali's hands trembled as he held it, his eyes filling with tears. He could no longer hide behind the armor of bravado. Rita leaned close, her voice steady. "You taught my son that promises matter more when no one's watching. That real strength isn't in the ring. It's in showing up when it costs you something. Thomas died believing he mattered to the greatest man in the world. You gave him that. You gave me that." The lesson Thomas Hearns extracted from Muhammad Ali in room 407 wasn't about boxing. It was about the difference between greatness and goodness, and the rare moments when they occupy the same person. Ali had spent his life in front of cameras, his every word archived, his every movement analyzed. But his most important work happened in the spaces between the spotlight: hospital rooms where children died, churches where grieving mothers buried their babies, gravesides where the only witness was the wind. He kept those promises, not because anyone would find out, but precisely because no one would. What makes a person great isn't the titles they win or the crowds they captivate. It's what they do when the world isn't watching, when there's no applause to chase and no trophy to claim. It's showing up at a stranger's funeral on a Thursday afternoon because you promised a dying child you would. It's sending birthday cards for 30 years to honor a boy who never got to grow old. It's understanding that the truest measure of strength is how gently you hold someone else's pain. Muhammad Ali shook up the world with his fists, but he changed it with his capacity to sit beside suffering without needing to fix it, to make promises to people who couldn't benefit his career, to honor the dying wish of a 9-year-old boy for 3 decades without ever claiming credit. The secret he kept wasn't about humility. It was about understanding that some moments are too sacred to share, some promises too important to publicize, some grace too profound to perform. Thomas Hearns never made it to 10 years old, but because of a promise kept in secret, he taught the world's most famous man that true greatness is measured not in championships, but in the quiet dignity of showing up when it costs you everything and gains you nothing, except the knowledge that you kept your word when it mattered most.